So the other day, I got into a heated debate with a friend of mine about the best year for survival horror games. By that, I don't mean the year that had the best individual survival horror game, but rather a combination of quality and quantity. And with so many fantastic survival horror games out there, I began making a list of my own where we saw the best years for survival horror games. So for today's list, I'm taking a look at every single survival horror game that has ever been released into consideration as I locate the best years for this subgenre. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel if you like the content that I bring you guys. Also leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 best years for survival horror games. Let's get it. Number 10, 1998. 1998 is a perfect example of quality over quantity. While there weren't a ton of survival horror games that were released in 1998, there were some really good entries that allowed this year to earn its spot on today's list. For example, we saw Square Enix enter the survival horror genre with a game of their own, Parasite Eve. This game combined survival horror with elements of role-playing games that created a unique experience within both of these genres. Hell, we even saw Sega take their shot at survival horror with a game called Deep Fear, but obviously the heavy hitter for 1998 in the survival horror genre is none other than Resident Evil 2. Personally, this is my favorite video game of all time, so you can imagine how hard it is for me to not rank this year higher on today's list. However, Resident Evil 2 and Parasite Eve are really the only things holding this year up enough to even make this list, and regardless of how incredible both of these games are, on their own it's not enough to raise it any higher on today's list. So we find it just barely cracking the top 10 best years for survival horror games. Number 9, 2004. 2004 doesn't have any of the best survival horror games, but it does have a handful of hidden gems within the subgenre. Probably its biggest release comes from Silent Hill 4: The Room. While not the best Team Silent game out there, most fans would argue that Silent Hill 4 was the last great Silent Hill game released before the franchise's downfall. Speaking of underrated games within a major survival horror franchise, we also saw Resident Evil Outbreak Files number 2 released this year as well. For those that don't know, the Outbreak Files 1 and 2 follow survivors during the Raccoon City outbreak as we explore different, never before seen areas of the infamous town from the second game. Then when you add in the prison survival horror game The Suffering and one of my favorite hidden gems out there, Obscure, it's no wonder why 2004 cracks the list for one of the best years of survival horror games as well. Number 8, 2001. With 2001, we saw the release of one of the best survival horror games ever created, while also seeing the releases of some smaller survival horror games. Let's start with arguably one of the best survival horror sequels ever created, Silent Hill 2. The story of James in Silent Hill 2 is still described as one of the best psychological stories told in a survival horror game, and in my opinion is a masterpiece. 2001 also saw the introduction of another major survival horror franchise, Fatal Frame. The idea of facing enemies with nothing but a camera is terrifying, and Fatal Frame set the stage for another fantastic sequel. While there wasn't a mainline Resident Evil game in 2001, we did get a few standout games, including Ill Bleed and a hidden gem that's available on PS4, PS5 right now as of this month, Alone in the Dark: A New Nightmare. This game took a lot of inspiration from Resident Evil 2 with two unique campaigns following two different characters, including Edward Carnby. With a year of hidden gems, one of the best survival horror sequels, and the start of a great survival horror franchise, 2001 stands out as one of the best years for the subgenre. Number 7, 2014. 2014 had a combination of forgettable survival horror games while also featuring two of the greatest modern survival horror games of all time. Starting with some lesser known releases, we have Fatal Frame 5, Maiden of Blackwater. Honestly, this game doesn't really compare at all to the original trilogy of the series, as 4 and 5 are some of the worst Fatal Frame games. With that being said, neither of those games are bad, and Fatal Frame is one of the rare franchises that, in my opinion, doesn't feature a single bad game. Moving over to a small hidden gem, Claire is a side-scrolling indie horror game that combines the atmosphere of the Silent Hill games with the gameplay of a Metroidvania game minus the combat. Stealth is key here, and you have nothing to rely on outside of your flashlight, your stealth abilities, and of course, your dog Anubis. However, the three big games that really elevate this year to the spot that we find it on today's list come from Darkwood, The Evil Within, and Alien Isolation. Darkwood to this day is argued as one of the best indie survival horror games, while people are still demanding sequels to both Evil Within 2 and Alien Isolation. Coming from the brilliant mind of Shinji Mikami, the original director of the first Resident Evil game, the original Evil Within was set in a recreation of the fictional city of Crimson City, where a detective must battle nightmarish creatures, his worst fears, and even a reality-bending final boss. Alien Isolation, on the other hand, is regarded as one of the scariest games out there thanks to the brilliant AI design for the iconic xenomorph straight out of the films. The xenomorph in Alien Isolation adapts to your playstyle and will continue to learn new ways to catch you off guard, making this monster probably the best stalker enemy ever created. The combination of limited resources, one of the best enemy AIs, and the terrifying setting of a space station all help Alien Isolation become one of the best and scariest survival horror games out there today. Number 6, 2017. 2017 is not only a brilliant year for survival horror games, but it's one of the best years for horror games, period. What really makes 2017 stand out though comes from the quality of survival horror games released this year. Let's start with the sequel to a game that we just talked about in the last entry, The Evil Within 2. Fans would battle you back and forth about which entry they prefer, but most would probably argue that The Evil Within 2 is better due to the improvement with the controls, visuals, and the scare factor. While Shinji Mikami didn't return to direct it like he did with the first one, The Evil Within 2 was a fantastic sequel, and in my opinion, it is one of the better survival horror sequels of all time. Speaking of fantastic sequels, another great follow-up to a phenomenal survival horror game was Outlast 2. While not as good as the original game, Outlast 2 still brought everything to the table that we saw in the first entry of this iconic found footage style series. Using a video camera to explore a demonic cult will leave you with nightmares after witnessing some of the jump scares waiting for you in this game. A few other releases include Vaccine, a small hidden gem inspired by Resident Evil, Bendy and the Ink Machine, a survival horror game with a unique animation style, and Prey, while not exactly a survival horror game, features all of the elements that make a good survival horror game like limited resources, terrifying enemy types, and multiple jump scares. However, the big release of 2017 of course comes from the ultimate survival horror franchise, Resident Evil. In 2017, we saw Capcom reinvent the franchise once again, only this time going a more horror-focused route with a first-person survival horror game, Resident Evil 7. Following Ethan Winters as he searches for his missing wife, Resident Evil 7 will throw everything at you. Molded creatures, a possessed wife of Ethan, and my personal favorite, the Baker family. Jack Baker is still one of the best stalker enemies of horror games. Marguerite Baker is one of the most terrifying boss fights in a horror game, and Resident Evil 7 is regarded as one of the scariest games ever created, especially in VR. Number 5, 2005. As we break the top 5 of this list, we start with probably my most controversial ranking, with 2005 claiming the 5th best year for survival horror games. I feel like people are going to be split about this one. The reason being is that 2005 features one of the most iconic survival horror games out there, Resident Evil 4. With that being said, it doesn't feature any blockbuster names outside of it. Most of the rest of the games that I'm going to talk about for this year are fantastic survival horror games, but are a little more unknown. Let's start with Condemned: Criminal Origins. This game is phenomenal and features some of the most terrifying enemies, like the department store where enemies will disguise themselves as mannequins. While not as well known as Resident Evil 4, it's still one of the scariest survival horror games out there. Something that I do believe deserves a lot of love though is Fatal Frame 3. In my opinion, this game doesn't stand up against either of its predecessors, but it is still the last great Fatal Frame game before the series goes downhill a bit. And like I said earlier, Fatal Frame is one of those rare occasions where I don't think a single game is bad, just worse than other entries. Probably the biggest hidden gem that you'll see pop up on today's list though is Haunting Ground. Basically a spiritual successor to Clock Tower, Haunting Ground is a survival horror game that allows you to team up with a cute white shepherd named Huey. Throughout the game, the player must hide and escape from different stalker enemies. Anyway, the last few survival horror games that I want to throw out there include Cold Fear, Pathologic, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, and finally, Fear, which is probably more of a psychological first-person horror game rather than a survival horror game, but I at least wanted to give it a quick shout out. Number 4, 2003. What really makes this year stand out compared to most years on this list is that 2003 actually features releases from just about every single major survival horror franchise. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Dino Crisis, Fatal Frame, hell, even a Forbidden Siren game released this year. And yeah, honestly, not all of the games within these iconic franchises were great. Take Dino Crisis 3 for example. Look, I don't know if the third Dino Crisis game could even be considered a survival horror game at this point. So straight up, maybe we really shouldn't include it. The franchise changed so much and it goes kind of off the rails and away from the horror elements that the first game had. But moving over to something that definitely elevates 2003 is a little game called Forbidden Siren. This survival horror game allows you to mind hack your enemies and see things from their point of view. It was something that was terrifying to experience and is still one of the craziest and scariest mechanics I've ever seen in a horror game. Manhunt was another forgettable yet great survival horror game. This game is regarded as one of the most brutal and fucked up survival horror games out there, so much so that it was banned in some countries. Yet there are 3 entries that really set 2003 apart from the rest. Firstly, you have Resident Evil Outbreak. While we did see Dead Aim released this year as well, Outbreak was more aligned with the survival horror roots as it fully explored different areas of Raccoon City during the outbreak. Then you had Fatal Frame 2. Let's face it, I don't think there's any argument to be made about what Fatal Frame game is the best or the scariest of the franchise. With iconic ghost enemies like the Broken Neck Woman, Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly will definitely scare the living hell out of you. However, my personal favorite survival horror game of 2003 is, of course, Silent Hill 3. While Silent Hill 2 gets a lot of love and is regarded as the best of the franchise, I would argue that Silent Hill 3 is the second best of the series and is even better than Silent Hill 2 in some areas. Heather Mason is one of the most badass female protagonists ever created, and between the terrifying locations, the disturbing enemies, and the extremely difficult puzzles, Silent Hill 3 is still regarded as one of the best survival horror games ever made. Number 3, 2002. Truthfully, the last 3 years on this list are really close, and I mean close as fuck. And 2002 has a special place in my heart as it released not 1, but 2 great Resident Evil games. Let's start with the other survival horror games that were released in 2002 first though. Probably one of the best hidden gems on the GameCube, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, is without a doubt a must play for survival horror fans. Everything about this game screams masterpiece. It's a hidden gem that really never got attention that it deserved due to the release of 2 Resident Evil games on the GameCube that same year. However, Eternal Darkness featured one of the scariest mechanics seen in horror games, the Sanity meter. As your Sanity meter fills, the game will begin playing tricks on you. It can fake glitches, create jump scares, and even pretend to shut the TV off or mute the volume. Another hidden gem of 2002 is The Thing. I'll admit, most movie licensed video games tend to be really bad. However, that's not the case with The Thing. With survival horror mechanics combined with both science fiction and whodunit horror, The Thing is probably the greatest survival horror game that you've never played. The last entry that I want to take a look at before we turn our attention to Resident Evil is Clock Tower 3. Clock Tower 2 was a disaster and it pretty much ruined the franchise. However, Clock Tower 3 was fantastic and unfortunately didn't do well in sales thanks to Clock Tower 2 turning the fans away from it. But if you're a fan of Haunting Ground where you'll need to outrun and hide from stalker enemies, then Clock Tower 3 is definitely a must play for you. Still, we know what the big releases of 2002 were. Resident Evil was on fire, and because of that we got 2 mainline games in the same year, one of which was Resident Evil 0. Sure, the game was difficult as fuck and the no item box mechanic was frustrating, but the core mechanics of this game included everything that we loved about classic Resident Evil games. But when you compare it to the other RE release of 2002, then this game looks like trash in comparison. Shinji Mikami returned to Resident Evil to direct the remake of the first game. Revisiting the Spencer Mansion with updated graphics that still hold up today was a fantastic experience, and honestly, it's probably one of the best remakes ever made. And I don't just mean out of the Resident Evil remakes, I mean ever. Plus, the 2002 remake included some awesome changes to surprise the players, including Lisa Trevor, Crimson Heads, and it even pulled a fast one on veteran players, expecting the dogs to jump through the window of the first floor hallway. Resident Evil Remake is one of my favorite games of all time, and when you combine it with the other releases of 2002, then it's no wonder why this year cracks the top 3 for best years in survival horror games. Number 2, 1999. If I was basing this list off quality alone, then I would probably rank 2002 higher than 1999. However, what 1999 does differently than most years of survival horror is that not only does it release good quality survival horror games, but releases a damn good amount of them. 1999 saw the release of 4 different major survival horror franchises in which each of these games were actually good, unlike a different year that we talked about earlier on this list. First, we take a look at Dino Crisis. With the success of Resident Evil, of course it made sense for Capcom to use the same formula for another survival horror game, but replace zombies with dinosaurs. And honestly, they weren't wrong. The original Dino Crisis has everything that you would want from a dinosaur survival horror game. Multiple types of dinosaurs, terrifying jump scares, and iconic boss fights against the king of the Jurassic Age, the iconic T-Rex. Dino Crisis gave us all of that, and in my opinion, this first entry is still the best dinosaur horror game ever made. Moving over to the start of yet another survival horror franchise, Silent Hill. Seeing how Capcom was making big bucks off of this genre, of course other studios like Konami wanted to get in on that cash. So they took a bunch of developers that they were probably going to fire soon and put them all on a job that didn't have much of a success rate. Hence, Team Silent was built. And the rest is history, as we saw Silent Hill take the world by storm as it became the second biggest and the best survival horror franchise. Watching Harry Mason battle monsters straight out of Alessa's nightmares while also exploring the creepy fog-filled setting of Silent Hill is something that remains an important part of my childhood. Speaking of Resident Evil, Capcom continued cranking out these entries as we also saw the release of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. While Resident Evil 2 failed to explore Raccoon City in its entirety, RE3 Nemesis covers that department by allowing the player to play as Jill Valentine as she takes on the father of stalker enemies, Nemesis. The game may not have been that long, and it was the first game of the franchise to not feature 2 scenarios, but Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is still regarded as a fantastic entry of the franchise. I've seen some people argue that it's better than both RE1 and RE2, though honestly I'm more of an RE2 person. On top of these major releases, we had sequels and other survival horror hidden gems released this same year. Parasite Eve 2, Square Enix sequel that went more survival horror than its predecessor, while still infusing it with the RPG genre. D2, which, like Parasite Eve, combines elements of RPG and survival horror, but also throws in first-person shooter combat as well. And Galerians, if I pronounce that correctly, is a hidden gem that follows a boy named Ryan who has psychic abilities, and it's basically Resident Evil, but instead of guns and bullets, you have psychic abilities to use in combat. Number 1, 2023. Let's face it, 2023 killed it, and honestly, this is what me and my friend argued about. I will sit here and defend last year with you guys over and over again about how amazing of a year for survival horror fans 2023 actually was. But let's break it down. Dead Space Remake. Let me tell you guys now, up until last year, I never played a Dead Space game. I know that's completely insane of me. But after playing the remake of Dead Space, I was inspired to revisit the entire franchise, and man, Dead Space fucking rules. Most cases with remakes, you see things cut and change that we don't actually agree with, but not with Dead Space Remake. Everything has been improved. Sound design, visuals, a new random enemy encounter system, and much more. Dead Space Remake is easily one of the scariest games I've played, and I'm really hoping that EA doesn't go through with the whole canceling the remake of Dead Space 2. Speaking of remakes, Resident Evil 4 was a fantastic one as well. As someone that wasn't a major fan of the original game, I wasn't as excited for this one, but the game did do a great job at improving the atmospheric horror of the areas throughout the experience. Sure, it's still not full-on survival horror like earlier entries of the series, but it's still an improvement. Alan Wake 2, my game of the year of 2023. Granted, I'm not a major fan of games like Baldur's Gate 3, but still, Alan Wake 2 was a masterpiece. After replaying the original game recently, I realized that game was more of a cult classic than something that was actually good. Yet, Alan Wake 2 made sure to stand out completely. It took inspiration from Resident Evil 2 Remake while also creating a semi-open world that actually worked for a survival horror game. The different areas that you could explore in both Bright Falls and the Dark Place felt endless, and I was happy with this game. And let's not forget all about the smaller yet incredible survival horror games that we got in 2023. Amnesia The Bunker becomes the first Amnesia game to actually feel like a survival horror game instead of a walking simulator. Exploring a World War I bunker while being chased by a terrifying monster with very limited resources was both exciting and thrilling to experience. My Friendly Neighborhood, an indie survival horror game that is basically a low-budget Resident Evil meets Sesame Street game. Daymare 1994, Sandcastle, a prequel to the indie horror game inspired by Resident Evil 2. Imagine battling zombies that can teleport, because that's essentially what Daymare 1994 is. Finally, you have asymmetrical horror games with elements of survival horror like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game and the Outlast Trials. 2023 was full of plenty of amazing survival horror games, each with their own unique takes on the genre. So with all that in mind, it's hard to imagine a year better than 2023 for survival horror, hence why it claims the #1 spot on today's list. But that does it for today's episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is 2023 really the best year for survival horror games, or is there a different year that deserves that title? Also, let me know if there are any years that you think deserve to be on today's list that I missed completely. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.